Boy, this reminds me of my dissertation defense with all these people sitting out here. All right. So when we were discussing about having the three of us up here, we came up with some questions. And the question that I'm asked to comment on this evening is price per hearing aid unit has decreased over a 10-year span, yet there's no appreciable increase in hearing aid units sold. Well, let's look at it from this perspective. In the hearing aid market, we've got the suppliers to the manufacturers. We've got the manufacturers who are selling their devices to the retailers or the audiologists, and then we've got the end users at the end of the chain here. And so, while the survey was done at the retail level, there are implications from the end user in this data. So we're also looking at demand, the demand data to some degree here. And so some of the data that Carl talked about can actually be explained through the law of demand in economics. And the hearing aid market has a demand that is what we call inelastic. It is price insensitive. And what that means is if we raise prices, we're not going to lose a large quantity of individuals from the market. On the flip side of it is if we reduce prices, we're not going to gain a market increase in the number of individuals that enter the market. Now, if we look at this data, and this is the data that Carl showed, what we're looking at here is at the premium level and at the mid-level, there was a price decrease. And at the economy level, there's a price increase. And if we go back to this demand curve, there's a mouse here, yeah, there is. So if we look at price, higher prices, you'll notice that there's a smaller quantity demanded, and as we lower the price, there's a higher quantity demanded. And so we're seeing that same effect here in the sense that the higher devices are going to have less quantities. If we look at price, what we're seeing here, and what Carl was talking about here, is they're dispensing fewer devices. Well, what's happened here is there's an increased quantity at the lower end, not at the higher end, where at the higher end, there's a decrease in the quantity. So both of these factors suggest that the market is inelastic, and we're starting to see those trends from that perspective. Now, if we look at the elasticity function and the optimal price, and what that means is this is the quantity demanded and the price are equal, they're equal 1. It's 1651, and I believe Carl showed a value of 1657 for the economy line, so we're somewhat close. At high prices, the demand function is what we call elastic, meaning that it is price sensitive. So here we will see large gains and losses depending on whether we increase or decrease those prices. At low prices, the demand function is inelastic. So if we look at it from a revenue standpoint, because the inelastic function or the price sensitivity is related to revenue, in a elastic demand, to increase total revenue, we want to reduce prices. So that is, for high-end devices, which are in the elastic component, we want to reduce the prices, which is what we're seeing. In the inelastic component, which is where the economy line or the low-end devices are, to increase total revenue, we're going to raise prices. So we're seeing these effects. Well, what does that mean in terms of revenue? So what I did was here, I extrapolated data from these graphs here, and I'm colorblind, so I use numbers 1 through 5 and 1 through 6. And what you're seeing here is, where's my mouse? Down here at the bottom and I'm using all the top end numbers. For gross revenue, a practice that has a gross revenue of $250,000 annually and a net profit of $50,000 has a profit margin of 20%. And you'll notice that it's the same profit margin for a $500,000 grossing practice. But as we get into the millions and $1.5 million range, the profit margin starts to increase. So the name of the game is to increase your margins, and there's different ways to do this. I think Dan's going to talk about this a little bit. But the name of the game is to dispense more units so that you can increase your profit margin. Now, what are some opportunities to increase these profit margins? And so we're going to talk about a few things here. The first thing is to increase something called perceived value. What perceived value is it's the trigger point at which the end user decides that he or she is going to go ahead with the purchasing of a product or a service. And if you look at this graph here, what this is showing us is the basic clinical model that we have. We have a provider. He or she has a facility. They offer these components. The provider also has a demeanor, and it provides these components. And the components from the provider are then perceived or analyzed by the patient. The most important component for the patient is the emotion. Okay? Emotion drives the limbic system, which then tells the cognitive system, yes, go ahead and do it, or no. And think of yourself at a grocery store. If you go in hungry, what happens? You tend to overbuy. And so then we pull the trigger on the perceived value, and then everything after that is what we call the post-purchase component of the cycle. And so what I want to look at very quickly here is the perceived value, and I'll start backwards. So we've got the patient approval, which comes from the perceived value. So they pull the trigger based on what happens at the perceived value, and the perceived value comes from a quality component and a price component. The quality component is dedicated to the attributes of the device and the attributes that come from the services that you provide. On the retail side, we're looking at the retail price of what you're telling the individual to the homework that they've done by looking on the internet. Now, if we look at data here, one of the ways to improve the perceived value is to unbundle. Now, this is a real hot topic, I understand, from the dispenser side, but the data that we're collecting here is actually from the end user side. And what you're seeing here, the graph on the left is a perceived measurement scale. This is out of business. 7, it's a Likert scale. 7 means that it's a poor component, and we want to be down here at the 1, meaning that they're liking it, the value's high. And what you'll look at is, if we look at, for the experienced listeners, so these are listeners who've had at least a device for a year, what we're seeing here is they're seeing the hearing aid as being expensive, but the value is less in the completely bundled approach. And if we go to the completely unbundled approach, you'll notice that the expense stays the same, but the value increases because it's closer to 1. If we go over here to the inexperienced users, you will notice that they are higher up on the graph, so they're emotionally less inclined to pull the trigger, so to speak. If we look at the completely bundled approach, the value is extremely low, the expense is moderately high, and when we go ahead to the completely unbundled approach, where we're being more itemized, more transparent, you'll notice that the expense comes down and the value comes down, and the down meaning that it's better. Another way to do it is the way in which you advertise. A lot of the times in the newspaper you will see this graph up here, and that is, you'll see a device and it says it's 100% digital. There's a professional fee, there's a 2-year warranty, and it's 50% off. And for the limbic system, it doesn't do too much. It doesn't get your, what I call your hearing aid pants going. You don't want to jump in the car and go out and get a device. If we look at this middle panel here we're using the manufacturer's jargon, the technical terms. So memories, bands, adaptive, this, cancellation. The end user doesn't understand that. But if we go down here to the end panel, the bottom panel, and we start talking in layman's terms, so we talk about the hearing aid has an adjustable volume control. It's going to improve listening effort, and so forth and so on. They're more inclined to come out and see you because these are where they're having issues, and now they know that the device and you can help them overcome those problems. So if we look again at bundled and unbundled as a function of the advertising here, so group 1 at the top, group 2 in the middle, and group 3 at the bottom. If we just look at the bundled versus the unbundled, bundled is lower on the graph, and this time we're using mean willingness to pay. And it's not so much the value, but it's the difference between these two on the scale, because this is a magnitude estimation scale. And what you're seeing here is, as we go from being what we, from the advertising frame that we find in the newspaper, in simply by unbundling, the value goes up. As we go from the manufacturer's technical terminology, from bundled to unbundled, the value goes up. And because they're seeing the itemization. And as we go from layman's terms in that third frame to the third frame in an unbundled approach, you'll notice that we are significantly higher in all aspects. So we're now improving that perceived value. Patient financing, Carl talked a little bit about this. This is a study that we did earlier this year. I've got to sit down and write this up at some point. And what we did a study in 2011 that looked at bundled versus unbundled. I showed you just a little bit of that. And so we redid it with a larger sample size. Before it was 40, now it's 120. And what you're seeing here is that we're basically replicating our data, which is a good thing. And if you look at the patient financing, as you offer patient financing in an unbundled approach, you're now adding an extra component to value, and they're willing to pay more for your services and that product. Okay, so let's go to the other side here. Let's go to the pricing side. So let's look at adoption rates. One of the key factors that's needed for adoption is we need to find some substitute products. And we need to do this because if you look at basic economic theory, substitutes are what help grow a market, and that's one of our problems. Now, this is from our lab. This is about 350 patients. The average time that they take to adopt a hearing aid after they've been diagnosed with a hearing loss is on the order of 6 years to 12 years. The longer they wait, the longer the individual waits to purchase a device, the less likely they are to do so. And so the question becomes, what can we use as a substitute product? Well, I'm going to tell you, and this is based on modeling, and I'll show you the modeling data in just a moment. The data suggests that PSAPs are not the way to go. And the reason is, personal sound amplification devices look like a hearing aid. They squeak like a hearing aid, so they're perceived to be a hearing aid. Okay. The other thing is with apps, most people own a smartphone. They can download an app, and all they have to do is put in a set of headphones, and they look cool just like their teenage grandkids and their kids. And there's relatively no cost. The largest segmentation right now, this is the Pew Institute, of individuals downloading apps is the 60+ year group. Okay? So this is some modeling that we've done here. This is what they call diffusion theory. So you're seeing the bold graph that I showed you earlier, and then we're running different models here by changing the demand function, the market penetration, and so forth and so on. And by using apps, what it allows us to do is it allows us to shift the 5 to 12 year span down to 6 months to 6 years. So we're basically having the data, having the adoption rate. And then the last thing I'm going to show you is this same graph, and I'm going to show it to you in a bar graph mode. So if we look at the number of individuals who have hearing loss, this is everybody. Today, in 2014, there are 35.32 million individuals with hearing loss. With a market penetration rate, this is from the HIA surveys, with a market penetration rate of 24.6%, that means that about 8.7 million individuals own a hearing aid, and the untapped market is 26.63 million. Now that 26.63 million includes everybody. So these are folks who have medical conditions that can be treated. These are individuals with single-sided deafness, cochlear implant patients, and so forth and so on. So we needed to tease out some of that data. So we use an economic model to do that. And so we leave the 8.69 million in. We run the model through here, and what it tells us is our true untapped market for the audiology sector is only 8.25 million, and there are 18.38 million individuals who either do not want or do not need our services. Now, with apps, not PSAPs, but with apps, if we run the data from the model I just showed you, this is what we get. It becomes a feeder. Now what happens is we have 9.24 million people as opposed to 8.69 million people who are using our devices. They've transitioned from the apps into using our devices, and we've now opened up a larger untapped market, which makes our group at the top here who either do not want or do not need our services smaller. Thank you.